people agree to this. We created this together. No one and no group of people can change certain aspects of the Constitution without getting our true consent. Consent granted under any form of duress cannot count. This is not partisan politics. I'm here as a churchman, and I'm not dabbling in partisan politics. This is about respecting all members of the constitutional constituents. This is about keeping our word in the covenant of which we are part. Each one of us is a part. This is about honoring the agreement we made together as a nation. This is about the Constitution being supreme, not the whims of politicians, not the hunger for power, but the law that we created together. In recent weeks, we have witnessed disturbing developments. As citizens, we have a responsibility to pay attention to how power is used by those with whom we have entrusted our power. We have a responsibility to speak when something is wrong. What we have witnessed is wrong, profoundly wrong on 4 counts. There is the procedural violation. We have watched a process that does not reflect the will of the people. We, the people of Zimbabwe, that are at the beginning of the Constitution. We, the people. In the past week, there's been minimal genuine consultation of the people of Zimbabwe on CAB3. Proposed changes shall have been that should have been presented to the people for open discussion and consideration were pushed through government-owned media as a government resolution to which citizens were required to agree. Alternative views were refused expression. Dissenting voices were silenced. This is not consultation. This is propaganda. A second violation is the democratic one. The corruption of the parliament. When parliamentarians have been bought like goods in a market, this is not leadership. This is corruption. This is not the people's parliament. Our parliamentarians are supposed to represent their constituencies. They are supposed to listen to the people who elected them. Instead, many have abandoned their constituencies for personal gain. They have sold their votes. They have betrayed their mandate. This exercise renders our parliamentarians illegitimate. By their failure to represent their constituencies' voices, many parliamentarians have ceased to legitimately represent their constituents in the people's minds. They and their CAB3 endorsement are divorced from the will of the people they claim to serve. This is corruption, and corruption that destroys democracy. The third violation is that of freedom, intimidation and harassment. Some people who spoke against this bill were harassed, some were threatened, some were harmed. When people are denied the right to express their opinion contrary to the proposal made, that is not democracy. That is dictatorship. That is the suppression of fundamental human rights. Freedom of expression is not negotiable. It is the foundation of democracy. Without it, we have tyranny. The fourth violation is bypassing the mandatory referendum. It's a violation of the Constitution. We have seen the Constitution being ignored deliberately and systematically. Section 328 of the Constitution is crystal clear. It states that the people must decide through a referendum on certain constitutional amendments, and this particular constitutional amendment requires that. Not Parliament, again, not Parliament, not politicians, but the people directly through a referendum. The reason for this is also quite clear. Those in positions of power entrusted to them by the people, should not decide changes that effectively extend their stay in power. without the people's true and direct permission.
Type of exclusionary governance is not sustainable in the long term, and that resistance will certainly emerge, and we can just hope and pray that it is the type of resistance that is constructive and peaceful in how it's conducted, rather than something like a military coup, which would likely take us into an even deeper constitutional crisis.
I guess that triggers sort of two thoughts for me. I mean, one, you've got great knowledge across the region. Are you seeing something here that you think sort of repeats processes we've seen in other countries of, going from being more competitive to being one party? And if so, what's the consequence of that? What does it mean for Zimbabwe to become a one party state? And I guess the other question is, maybe sort of related to that. Essentially, Zimbabwe's had very constrained competition for a long time. The opposition has always found it, from very difficult to impossible to actually be able to win elections. Does the kind of formal closing off of the opposition make a massive difference in your mind? Or is this in some ways a process of evolution rather than revolution?
Well, one of the surprising things about this whole process was that because the opposition was so ineffectual, and I'll use that word very advisedly, the ZANU-PF didn't have to do this. So the first reaction was very, very much that this was a presidential aspect of Zimbabwean politics, wanting to stay in power. But it puts Zimbabwe very much on the outer. Throughout Southern Africa, most of Africa, in fact, there's been a movement away from that kind of concentration of power into a greater pluralism. And one of the distressing things about the Zimbabwean process right now is that the country seems to be going backwards. And this is not what it wants to do. This is not what it should do. But this seems to be the outcome that is probably going to happen. And it gives, as it were, a very, very great deal of disappointment to those of us who've supported the process in Zimbabwe from the very beginning. We had high hopes for the country, wanted it to go forward and be a role model, rather than being a role model in terms of how to go backwards and be behind the times. So you have, as it were, a spectacle which is not edifying. You have a spectacle which is not going to inspire people, and it's a spectacle which is likely to turn the attention of Western governments away from helping Zimbabwe. I was one of those who advised David Lammy, before he became Foreign Secretary, that it might be time to give some inducements to Zimbabwe to return to the mainstream. We don't know who is going to be the next foreign minister in the new Labour government, but that advice will now be withdrawn. And what you've got is this air of disappointment. You've got this air of disgruntlement, not only among young people in Zimbabwe, but I walk past Zimbabwe House in London every single day. In fact, what the ambassador doesn't know is that his building backs up onto my gymnasium, so I could easily drill my way through and sabotage the whole thing. But every week there's a demonstration of young Zimbabweans, part of the diaspora, and they're all completely against this kind of concentration of power. So as I said, what you've got is a world view, which I'm very, very much aware of, and a regional view. I'll be in Zambia shortly to cover the elections there. Zambia is going in exactly the opposite direction, trying to run decent, open elections, with faults, of course, but decent and open overall, whereas Zimbabwe is the country in the region that is going backwards. I'm not sure that Zimbabwe wants to be the backward neighbor in SADC. That's what it's going to become.
Thanks, Steve. And one of the things that was striking, I thought, when we were discussing earlier, is that I might be wrong, but I don't think any of our speakers mentioned the international community that much. And I feel that that's partly perhaps because we are now in a world in which the international community is not doing much on democracy. We've seen the US explicitly state that it won't be involved in pro-democratic activities. We've seen, of course, the slashing of aid budgets across Europe, not just in the UK, but more broadly. And we've seen a greater reluctance from donors, even than 10 years ago, to actually speak explicitly about kind of democracy promotion and human rights. Is that sort of leads to the question, I suppose, of, is it worth trying to engage the international community? Is it worth, is the international arena a worthwhile one? Not that the international community shouldn't have a moral obligation to be involved, but that given the positionality of the African Union, the European Union, the UK and the US right now, it's so hard to generate that kind of engagement. Do you see sort of opportunities for applying pressure on those international bodies to actually get them more engaged, to create the kind of space that might be needed for the sorts of protests and engagement that Doug and Tande or others have sort of highlighted?
Well, as I said, I tried to do that when Starmer's government came to power here in England. It was clear that David Lammy was going to be the foreign minister. We don't know, as I said, who's going to be the next foreign minister. But yes, I think it is worthwhile. But you see, it requires, as it were, some foundation from which to act. Every time I'm in Washington and I visit the State Department, their question to me is very, very straightforward. Stephen, why should we help Zimbabwe? This is quite apart from aid questions, quite apart from issues to do with aid and healthcare and all of those kinds of things are being withdrawn. Just in terms of political demeanor and political relations and positivity of relations, the question is, Stephen, why should we help them? What inducement, what kind of profile are they giving us that we can justify helping them? And right now, I have to say very, very frankly, I can't answer that question. No, there's nothing that they're doing to reach out to the international community. So any complaints that the international community is not helping us, well, that would have been self-engendered. I'm very, very disappointed about that, because the international community was at the very beginning very, very highly disposed towards Zimbabwe. A huge amount of goodwill was invested in the country, and now that goodwill simply doesn't exist anymore. So Zimbabwe is a country in the world. It's just become, as it were, a member of the Security Council. It can't avoid its membership of the world. Then why does the world not take Zimbabwe seriously? This is a big question that those in the corridors of power in Zimbabwe should ask themselves.
Prevent that role. You experienced that firsthand and some of the intimidation and violence that was involved in the process. So can you describe for people who aren't so familiar with Zimbabwe, what was happening in this public consultation process, what you experienced and what it reveals about the wider environment around CAB3?
Yeah, sure. So, so legally, in terms of our constitution, it's a requirement that for a constitutional bill, there has to be widespread public consultation for 90 days. And the consultation process that was conducted by Parliament was completely unlawful from the outset. For a start, there was very limited hearings. There was only about 60 hearings for a country of 17 million people. But then the meetings themselves were just horrific. They were essentially degenerated into ZANU-PF rallies where either no one who was opposed to the bill was allowed to speak, or anyone who was opposed to the bill was violently assaulted. So I was one of those who was assaulted at those hearings. I didn't get an opportunity to speak. In fact, at the hearing in Harare, not a single person who was opposed to the bill was allowed to speak. The person with the microphone was literally moving around with bouncers who violently assaulted anyone who tried to get close to the mic. And the mic was only given to praise singers. On my way out, I was then attacked by a group of identified members of ZANU-PF, including a member of the ZANU-PF Central Committee, Mnangagwa. My phone was stolen. I was assaulted. I was insulted, told that I'm not Zimbabwean. I've pressed charges against these people, but the police have not pursued the case. So this is the general environment in which these public consultations were happening, and that illegality really just persisted into the hearings. Into the parliamentary process itself, where we saw multiple instances members of parliament being openly bribed. Our statute books say that it is a criminal offence for members of parliament to receive a gift or reward for opposing or supporting any bill in parliament. And yet we have multiple instances where Wicknell Chibayo explicitly stated that he was giving vehicles to members of parliament as a reward for their submissions on CAB3. And just today we had the addition to that, the chief whip of ZANU-PF received a belated birthday present from Wicknell Chibayo, just after the bill has passed, very much due to the whipping system within parliament. So the process within parliament itself has been fraught with illegalities, criminal conduct, brazenly criminal conduct. There is a court case that has been brought on precisely that issue, saying the president should not sign that bill until this issue has been resolved, about the fact that there were members of parliament who were engaged in criminality in how the proceedings in parliament were conducted.
Thanks. So given that and where we are, as I understand it, you can correct me, the only thing that is now, between, as it were, this coming into effect and the current Zimbabwean constitution is the signature of President Mnangagwa. That's the only thing that's left. So the question I have now for you, Doug, as a lawyer is, where are we legally? Are there going to be any opportunities to legally appeal this if President Mnangagwa signs it? Or are we in a situation where, with the state of the courts and with the state of the justice system and the amount of money being spent, as you just described, where essentially the legal challenges aren't going to be effective and this has to be a sort of form of political resistance? Or are we at a stage where it's actually becoming unfeasible to see a way of preventing this from coming into law? We'd love your perspective on that.
Sure. So the first thing to say is that legally, the next step in the process is a referendum. So the Constitution is absolutely clear, black and white on this point, that where a constitutional amendment bill, such as this one, amends Section 3 to 8 of the Constitution, which is the provisions around amendments, which the bill explicitly does. It explicitly seeks to avoid that provision. It must go to a referendum within 3 months of it being passed by Parliament. In addition to that, where a bill amends the Bill of Rights, it must go to a referendum. And while the bill doesn't explicitly amend the Bill of Rights, it clearly does so in several instances. For example, Section 67, which is one of the rights in the Bill of Rights, provides that all citizens have a right to vote in all elections. That will no longer be the case post CAB3. All citizens will not have a right to vote for the president. Only those citizens who happen to be members of parliament will have a right to vote in that election. So that right has been amended, and therefore that bill must go to a referendum. So that's the first point to make, is that legally it must go to a referendum. But the proponents of the bill have made it absolutely clear that they have no intention of abiding by the Constitution and have sent the bill straight to the president. So to that degree, politically and to some extent legally, in that it will have legal effect until set aside. It's only the president's signature that stands between the bill becoming a law and an enacted amendment to the Constitution. But then, to your question, there's still a long road ahead of us and many options available in terms of challenging that process. Certainly, well, there is already litigation before the courts seeking to declare that Parliament ought to have sent it, or challenging this aspect around the process and the criminality involved in the process. And then there are questions around the referendum, the legality of the president signing it without a referendum. And then there are the questions of the substance of the bill itself, which is what we call the basic structure doctrine, where there's something called unconstitutional constitutional amendments, where a constitutional amendment completely undoes the entire constitutional architecture of a country. That is what we call in constitutional law an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. and so there will be challenges to the substance of the bill itself. So the courts are one arena, and they will remain an important arena. Yes, Zimbabwe's courts have the independence of Zimbabwe's courts have been undermined for decades by the executive, and that's one of the things that this bill, these amendments do as well, is seeks to further undermine the independence of the judiciary. So yes, that independence of the judiciary, there is a question mark around that. However, as Professor Maduku has rightly put, even a compromised court has a kind of a floor below which it can't go, below which it no longer even can consider itself to be a court. And I think, especially around the question of the referendum, I think that the judges of the Constitutional Court, who have already ruled on this matter in the Marx Mupungu case, the courts have already ruled that Section 95 is a term limit provision, is subject to Section 328. So the courts, I believe it may be going too far for them to actually abandon their old judgments and say, you know what, we're just going to let you do whatever you want. So we'll see how that plays out in the courts. But certainly the courts cannot be the only arena. There is, of course, the arena of the streets. You'll see I'm wearing my Section 59, the right to demonstrate hoodie. The Constitution gives us the tools, we the people. It gives us the tools that we need in order to defend the Constitution. And first and foremost among those is Section 59, the right to demonstrate. This is how ordinary citizens build power, shift power dynamics, and push back to hold those in power accountable. Our Constitution says that all power is derived all authority to govern is derived from the people of Zimbabwe. And when those who are in authority no longer seek to derive their authority from us, then we, the people, have the right to withdraw our consent to be governed by those who no longer consider themselves deriving their authority to be from us to govern us. And principle among how we do that is Section 59. So there is still a long road ahead. Citizens certainly must not give up. But even if after all of that goes through, and even if all of those processes play out, and CAB3 still stands as law, all that will mean is that our struggle for democracy has entered a new and different phase. But certainly that cannot be the end. We will just have to rely on some of those other arenas more than we have in the past. I'll speak to your question, Nick, in terms of where might that resistance to CAB3 emerge from. I think you're absolutely right that we have not seen the mass resistance that one would hope or expect when there's something as existential a threat to our democracy as this is. And I think that is in large part due to the level of repression. Many of the key organizers were in prison throughout the entire CAB3 process. Some of those have been released now. Student leaders have been released, but there's been a very high level of repression. I think that the students is certainly one place where we may see some kind of resistance emerging. That is, true in many countries around the world, that young people often play a critical role. We saw that with Gen Z protests in Kenya and elsewhere. I think that the church potentially has a very important role to play. So churches spoke out very strongly against CAB3 during the consultation process, in particular the Catholic Church, the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe, and the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, which are the sort of mainline Protestants. Those three, together with the Eudiocese, form the Zimbabwe Heads of Christian Denomination, and represent, I think, over 70% of churches in Zimbabwe gave very powerful critiques of the bill. The question then is whether that can translate to beyond just a verbal critique into real action on the ground. But if you look, throughout the region, often that has been the case. In the DRC, when Kabila sought to cling onto power, the Catholic Church played a very critical role in pushing back against that. I think the trade unions have an important role to play as well. Of course, the trade union movement has been decimated, over the past few decades. But there are still some strong trade unions that have provided some resistance. So I think these are some of the places where that may emerge. Often, before that type of thing happens, it looks like it's impossible. And then after it happens, people will say, oh, well, it was inevitable. So what will be the trigger event? I don't know. Will that trigger event come now or in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? I don't know. But what I do know is that this type of exclusionary governance is not sustainable in the long term. And that resistance will certainly emerge, and we can just hope and pray that it is the type of resistance that is constructive and peaceful in how it's conducted, rather than something like a military coup, which would likely take us into an even deeper constitutional crisis. To the last part of your question, whether some kind of a formal opposition could emerge out of that. I think that is a real possibility, and you've mentioned that there is a history of that in Zimbabwe. But my view on this is that we are so far away from a democratic transition via an election in Zimbabwe that should not be the focus at all right now. The focus should be on building a mass-based, grassroots, non-partisan movement that is able to push back on these authoritarian influences, and that where reforms are able to be extracted, and perhaps if we're able to reverse some of not just CAB3 but even CAB2, which took us several steps backwards, where we're able to extract some reforms through a mass movement, that I think where we now have democratic elections, I think that a legitimate political party as an electoral vehicle to get you over the line may emerge organically from that process. But I think that ought not to be where the attention is right now, because we have more immediate needs to focus on.
Thanks so much, Doug. And so one thing that you said there, maybe just to throw additionally into the mix, is, there is a significant question here, and there has been over the last few months, in Zimbabwe, about whether or not we might see further military intervention. Of course, we know that, as a number of people on the panel hinted, in a sense, this is designed to insulate President Mnangagwa from popular critique, more than it's designed in some ways to do anything else. It's really about protecting the president. And we've seen this sort of constitutional reform introduced in other countries, Togo and so on, Angola, where one of the key roles it's played is to insulate, increasingly unpopular presidents from public scrutiny. So there is an interesting question about, what forms of resistance there might be within ZANU-PF or within the military. We've also, of course, seen President Mnangagwa coup-proofing over the last couple of years, trying desperately to do things that would ward off the potentiality of another coup. So I just throw it out there. Maybe Steve and someone wants us to pick up on the question of, these kinds of changes which close off the opportunity of other people becoming president can be very destabilizing, precisely because there are so many people who don't necessarily want President Mnangagwa to stay in power. And of course, one of the things that's implied by this constitutional change is that he also wants to be able to control who's in power even after he's in power. This is also about managing succession as well as managing his own time in office. But